Joining me now, Jennifer Piscopo. She's the co-editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender, a professor of gender and politics at the Royal Holloway University of London, and the director of the school's Gender Institute. Molly Jong-Fast is a special correspondent for Vanity Fair, host of the Fast Politics podcast, and an MSNBC political analyst. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for helping us in this conversation. Molly, twice in the past 3 election cycles, we've had a chance to elect a woman president. A number of people who made this point, including Republicans, that there's no real question about her qualification in both cases to be president. They were both quite qualified to be president, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. We lean into this economic anxiety thing, and it's not that it is untrue and that there is not economic anxiety, but there's something else going on here that in order to move forward, we've all got to accept about ourselves. I just listed a whole bunch of countries, and I left out even more, that have no problem electing women as leaders of their countries, good or bad. Some of those leaders were good and some of them were bad, but they can vote for women. Yeah. No, look, most qualified person maybe ever, I mean, probably not ever, but she, vice president, elected senator, elected attorneys general. I think part of what Donald Trump did is that he leaned into a lot of the institutionalized misogyny as a way to try to neutralize her effectiveness. So she was a super effective speaker, really galvanized voters in a really important way. And what the Trump campaign did, and I think ultimately they were able to, was they flooded the internet with over-sexualized images of her. They spread lies about her romantic history, and they attacked her husband too, right? They sort of did a full court press on the institutionalized misogyny that is very much a part of American life, and they brought that out. And you'll remember, he ran this bros campaign, right? A campaign that was largely sort of anti-woman in a way. Even many Republican women who supported Trump commented on that. Right. Say, guys, could you just back off this for a moment, the testosterone campaign? And I think there was a question of whether men would turn out, because they don't turn out the same way women voters do necessarily historically, but they really did. So I think he leaned into something that has already really existed in American culture for a long time. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of us, it was successful. Jennifer, other nations and cultures around the world have elected women to higher offices. They're not all fantastic countries that have the best human rights. Some do, some don't. What are the affirmative things that we can perhaps learn from other countries who have elected women that we might use in the United States? I don't know what they are. What are the things that allow women to succeed to the highest office in other countries that prevent them from doing so in the United States?
Well, I wish I had a magic formula for you, but my take is going to be a little more skeptical. We see countries across the globe bringing women into the highest position of power, but in recent decades, right, there have never been about more than 20 women who have held the highest executive office at a time in about 190 countries. So while we should look to other countries as examples, we are still talking about a very high office to achieve. Many of those examples and those opening stories come from countries that have dual executives, where women are reaching the executive branch, but they are not in the executive position. They're in the secondary position, not the most important. What we see when we look at these patterns is that even globally, women still have a very defined route to the executive office. So men can win in executive office in all kinds of ways. They can run campaigns from incumbent parties, from popular parties, from not popular parties. They can run as bridge builders like Obama. They can run as elder statesmen like Biden, and they can run as angry populists like Trump. And in all of those models, they win. Because there are far fewer women that are winning globally, we see that women's path to the chief executive office, especially the presidency, is much narrower. Recently, where we've had women presidents, they've won only when they've been the candidate for a popular incumbent party, right? So they're promising to continue good times, and they are often seen as the successor of the outgoing leader of that popular incumbent party. This is a very narrow path to the presidency. We have very few examples of women being able to run and win campaigns based on brashness, based on boldness, based on hypermasculinity, the kind of energy that Trump brings to the table. So we have the misogyny of the American populace that Molly identifies, and we still have very limited leadership profiles available to women generally, both in the U.S. and globally.
Molly, I want to play a clip of Donald Trump from earlier this summer. Let's listen to this.
How would they consider a Harris presidency? Just in geopolitical.
I think they'll walk all over her. I think
so?
they'll look at her. I think they'll walk all over her. She'll be so easy for them. She'll be like a play toy. They look at her and they say, we can't believe we got so lucky. They're going to walk all over her. And I don't want to say as to why, but a lot of people understand it.
I don't want to say as to why, but a lot of people understand this. They'll treat her like a play toy. I mean, that's just wild that that stuff is said out loud and not held to account by a journalist who's saying it. But the one thing about Donald Trump is he does say the quiet parts out loud.
Yeah. I mean, he effectively got other men who believe what he believes to support him in this moment. And I think there was, it was it is also, she did inherit an almost impossible situation, right? We had these incumbency headwinds that almost everybody, and she did run a flawless campaign as much as anyone could have. She really did, and if you look at the lower ticket, the senators at the bottom of the ticket, the congressmen, they performed much better than they would have in swing states, which is a sign that she really did make a big difference. But it was an impossible situation. And yes, I do think ultimately these gender divides were just impossible for her.
Jennifer, are there specific things that we should be thinking about outside of politics? In other words, I know in certain European nations, they've got requirements about women on corporate boards or the involvement of women in civil society. Is that a direction we should be thinking about, or is this purely politics?
They actually even have requirements for women in politics. So other countries, not just in Europe and Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, have over the past few decades made a deliberate effort to cultivate the pool of women who are available to run for the highest office. And they've done that by adopting measures that encourage or even require political parties to field a certain number of women as legislative candidates. So we don't like to use the word quota in the United States. It does something to people's brains when they hear the word quota. But internationally, the idea of a gender quota for women candidates is not weird. It's not idiosyncratic. It is in place in more than 100 countries across the globe. So if you look at that recent example where Claudia Sheinbaum won the Mexican presidency in 2024, just in June, took office last month, her victory follows on 30 years of Mexican political parties being required to run certain numbers of women for highest office, creating an absolute pool of women who can stand and compete with men, and creating a normalization of seeing women hold some of the highest office, not just as senators and members of the House, but also as governors and also as top cabinet ministers. So other countries have invested a lot more in closing some of these gender gaps in politics and outside of politics than the United States.
I want to thank both of you for this important conversation. Jennifer Piscopo is the director and professor of the Gender Institute at the Royal Holloway University of London. Molly Jong-Fast, special correspondent at Vanity Fair.